Hello, this is Mr. Huff, and I want to do a real quick overview of the rules for dimensioning when you do technical drawings. One of the things I want to point out is that some guiding principles are that your drawings should be easy to read, and you shouldn't have measurements crossing each other and lines crossing each other if you can avoid it. Okay, and if you kind of pay attention to that, keeping your lines from crossing and not cluttering up your measurements, keeping things separated and with white space in between them, your drawings will look pretty good and you'll be probably all right. But let's pay attention to some of the details. All right, so the rule number one is making sure that the dimensions reflect the actual size of what you're going to produce. So if you think about this, you're making instructions to send to someone to build, and you need to tell them exactly the measurement that you need. So in this case, you need it to be 2 inches wide and 1 inch tall and 1 inch deep. You wouldn't actually measure the size of the drawing, you're describing the dimensions needed to produce the part. Second rule. You need to include the major dimensions for depth, width, and height. And you want to avoid this. See how these measurements are all clustered up and crossing over each other here? This is bad news. You want it to look like this, where the shorter measurements are underneath the wider measurements. So I normally start with the shortest and work my way to the longest. So make sure you describe the width and height and depth. There's those 3 measurements right there. Okay. Include all dimensions necessary to produce or inspect the part. In this case, you don't know what the length is here or what the height is here. So you need to make sure to include enough measurements to correctly make the part. So if you sent this to a machine shop, they would send it back to you with a note saying, we don't know what this is. So be sure you include all the necessary dimensions to describe the part. On the opposite side of that, don't give too many measurements. So in this case, if you look at this drawing, there's a lot of duplication, lots of repeated measurements. You only need to specify it one time. So look at here and here, and here and here, we've got duplication. Don't do that. Also, as far as unnecessary dimensions, don't use this measurement strategy. This is called a chain measurement, and we are not going to be using this. This is used in architecture to show that the length of the wall is what you're measuring, and we're not going to use these. We're going to use the ones where it runs from one reference edge and goes across the part. That is what you would send to a machine shop, so we're going to take that attitude this year. Also, if you add these up, it's the same as this. So you're duplicating these measurements. So it's 0.5, 0.5, that's also 1. So you would normally not do that. So what you're normally going to do is going to look like this, where you have all the measurements shown from one reference edge. So from here you go from the bottom to the top, and from here left to right. Fifth dimensioning rule. Dimensions should be attached to the view that shows the contour. So look at the top view. This doesn't really tell you the contour. It tells you very specifically the distances from the left to the right, but the front view makes more sense for this drawing. So if you move your dimensions here, it makes a lot more sense because you're telling us about the contour of the shape, not where the edges are. Okay, so use the contour to describe the measurements when possible. And I don't even think you can do this in Inventor where you measure dimension between 2 parts. But if you do, you're doing it wrong. All the dimensions should be connected to one drawing. So we have this projection of the front. All the measurements are connected to it. Don't bridge between the different views. Okay, I'm going to switch to correct here. Notice this zone here, the zone between the drawings, this area in here, most of your dimensions are going to lie in this area. On occasion, you will have to put one on the outside edge or at the bottom or on top, but most of your measurements should be here. This 0.75 makes sense because there's no other place on this drawing that we could put 0.75 to show this height. You wouldn't want to put it on the right side because you would have to have an extension line crossing an object line. So this one makes sense to put here. Everything else needs to be between the top and front and between the front and right. Avoid dimensioning to hidden lines. Do not dimension to this. And this is one of the most common mistakes I see in drawings is you just grab that line and dimension to it. It doesn't make sense. Don't dimension there. Dimension to the appropriate lines. Don't dimension to hidden lines. And in the context of what we draw this year, I'm going to change this statement to do not place dimensions on the object, period. There is not going to be any situation this year where you have to do this. You can always dimension outside of the part. So don't dimension inside the object lines. Notice how it makes it look really cluttered, and it would be really easy to make a mistake if you were having this built. This is much cleaner. I want your drawings to look like this. 10th rule, don't cross dimension lines with another dimension line or with an extension line. So these crossovers here and here are bad. Don't do that. That's why we start with the shortest measurements on the inside and work to the longest measurements on the outside. Also, same rule, don't cross these lines here. This makes it real cluttery in this zone, and it's real easy to get confused about what measurements you're describing here. So if you're talking about a diameter, it needs to be where the leader line is not crossing, and that it's easy to see. See how it's just tidy? That's what we want, is tidy drawings. Notice how, oh, next drawing. Okay. When you talk about leader lines for circles and arcs, we want those to be slightly angled. You don't want them to be horizontal or vertical because that will make it easy to confuse with other extension lines. So if you see a leader at an angle, that's telling you that we're talking about something circular, either a radius or a diameter is being defined. Notice how these are very difficult to read because they stack right up next to each other. Two ways you could fix this. One, you could make the distance between these a little longer and spread the numbers out, or you could stagger these. So this is a case where you need to break one rule to make it easy to see. Normally you want this number exactly in the middle between the two arrowheads. But here it doesn't make sense because it would make these numbers overlap each other. So we're staggering them around the center line so that we can easily read them. At the end of the day, being legible and tidy is the goal. Inventor is going to take care of this, so if you're dimensioning a circle, it's going to default to the diameter, and if you're dimensioning an arc, it's going to default to radius. So that's not something you normally have to worry about. Also, don't dimension to hidden lines, so that's why this is incorrect mostly. But also, if you're dimensioning a hole, it makes more sense to actually dimension the hole where it's visible. Okay, so that's why we would dimension on this view, not on the right view. We would dimension on this front view because that gives us the most information about this hole. That it's all the way through, it's ½ inch across, it's 1 inch from this edge, and it's 1 inch from the upper edge, or ½ an inch. So, and the last rule, the holes are located by their center lines. This has to do with how a drill works. So a drill has a point, so you need to know exactly where that drill is going to come in contact with your metal piece or your plastic piece or whatever it is to make this hole. That's why we dimension to the center line. And also it is perfectly okay to extend these lines, the little center line marks, across the edges so that they can be used for dimensioning. That's perfectly okay. And that's all I have to say about the 16 rules of dimensioning. That's just a quick overview. Again, rule of thumb is make sure that you're putting things kind of where they belong. Make sure it's tidy. Make sure you're not crossing things over. Another thing to watch out for is on your drawings, you're going to have borders. Keep some white space between your drawings and measurements and those borders. Kind of make it centered on the page so it looks nice. And that's enough for now.